welcome to Talk About Teddy, weekly conversations exploring the world of Theodore Roosevelt.
Hosted by Kurt Skinner.
And co-hosted by Larry Marple. Our guest today is Mark Lee Gardner, who's written a number of critically acclaimed and award-winning books to include his best-selling nonfiction titles, To Hell on a Fast Horse, The Untold Story of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, Shot All to Hell, Jesse James, The Northfield Raid and the Wild West's Greatest Escape, and The Earth is All That Lasts, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and The Last Stand of the Great Sioux Nation, which was chosen by True West Magazine as the best nonfiction book of 2022.
Currently, he is writing the stories of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. His writing has earned numerous awards, to include 2 Western Writers of America Spur Awards and Best Book Award from the Wild West History Association. As an authority on the American West, Mark has appeared on the History Channel, PBS American Experience, NPR's All Things Considered, and BBC Radio. A native of Missouri, he holds an MA in American Studies from the University of Wyoming and lives with his family at the foot of Pikes Peak.
But the book we are particularly excited to talk about with Mark today is his 2016 work, Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt, His Cowboy Regiment, and the Immortal Charge Up San Juan Hill. Mark Lee Gardner, welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kurt and Larry. I went alphabetically. I hope that's the right way. So
that's perfect.
I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for being the premier historical author on our show. It's exciting.
Well, I like to think of myself as a premier author, so this is very appropriate, I think.
Yes, it is.
First in the hearts of history lovers.
Yeah. And there's a lot of them out there, so yeah.
There are.
Well, as we said, besides all of your other Western American history books, we're particularly interested in how TR touches the American West here. So as a writer of the American 19th century Western stories, how do you see the Rough Rider story fitting into that genre?
Well, the Rough Rider book was a bit of a struggle to get approved by my publisher, but because I actually had submitted other ideas before the Rough Riders, and then my agent and another author had suggested the Rough Riders, and as soon as they suggested it, as a kid, TR just fascinated me, but as a Western historian, this story seemed to be so Western because of many of the men that made up that regiment, from Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. Of course, we know there were lots of others from the East Coast in there too, but even at the time, it seemed like a Western story, right? Because the individuals who kind of came up with this concept of Rough Riders, they envisioned, the rootin' tootin' sharpshooting cowboys. And, they'd make the perfect fighters in a war. And so even its very beginnings were kind of rooted in the American West. So to me, it was just like a natural. I felt like I was just, writing another Western story. It ended up being much more than that. But at its core, it felt very Western to me.
Yes.
Yeah, because there were other regiments that were supposed to have been raised like the Rough Riders.
Yes, exactly. I think there was a total of 3, weren't there? One in Wyoming, and then one from the Dakotas, I believe. Mm-hmm. And those poor guys just didn't get their act together in time.
No.
So
they needed a TR, right? Because TR, it's like, man, you got a ramrod. He made sure that they were not going to miss that. And, I really think that had TR not been a member of that regiment, they probably wouldn't have made it to Cuba like the others.
He had good connections.
Well, he's, of course, he's a political animal as well as lots of other things. So, yeah, he knew all kinds, whether it was senators, congressmen, or whatever. But I think it wasn't just the connections to me with TR. It was this unbridled enthusiasm and energy. I mean, he does not take no for an answer. He never did, right? Kind of, unless he was forced to. So I think it was part of, his own being that kind of willed this to happen. So, yeah, it helped that he had the connections. But I don't know. I think somebody else, even with the connections, they just didn't have what TR had as far as, what did he say? I put myself in the way of things happening, and they happened. And he was better at that than anybody else.
Yes.
Right. Being the only regiment to make it to Cuba out of the three, I think it was just that drive to, I will do whatever it takes to get us to Cuba.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was at every level, and you guys know this. I mean, whether it was getting the Krag Jorgensen carbines, the certain kinds of uniforms, at every level, he was striving to make sure that they were going to get there and they were going to have what they needed when they got there. And if they had to sacrifice their horses to get there, they're going to sacrifice whatever they had to do, he was not going to miss this, and he was going to make sure the regiment did not miss this. Mm-hmm. Even what did they commandeered a boat, right? Basically, and
yep.
in Tampa. So
yeah, the Yucatan.
I think his personality, his motivations, his energy, there was no one else like him, and he essentially willed his regiment to Cuba and up San Juan Hill eventually too. So
that's a good way of putting it. He willed them to Cuba, whether it was trains to catch or boats to catch, or being the first to disembark at Daiquiri in Cuba, and then Joe Wheeler being at the head of things and pushing them inland. And he was just, it's not necessarily just luck. But
without TR's force of will, they wouldn't have made it to Cuba. They wouldn't have led the march through Las Guasimas to that battle to anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, they would have been back in Tampa.
Yeah, and sometimes that was a detriment, right? I mean, we have this debate. I don't know if it's still a debate, but at Las Guasimas, the foolhardiness, they kind of go into an ambush, and they didn't like that word. We knew where they were, but it sure seemed like an ambush to the men that were that were there fighting, and they were so eager to get in there and to fight, and they got to fight. But so sometimes that can backfire, but more often than not, that was a positive for TR.
Larry and I are both incredibly impressed with the storytelling, that craft that you have, but it's not just a function of you inventing narrative here. We know that you are rooted in the source material, and it's just the writer's craft of making it seem as if you were there and adding that color. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the sources that you found particularly helpful in putting stories together like this.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, I really feel like my book I feel like they're telling the story. I tried to write it that way. I mean, I do want you to have the feel of you are there, but you have that feeling because it's their words often. And I did that through a wealth of Rough Rider letters, diary excerpts, and of course TR's own writings. And he wrote prolifically about the experiences and the experience of his regiment. But one of the things that I really benefited from that previous authors on this topic hadn't was that there's several websites of digitized newspapers from the 19th century and earlier. And years ago, that didn't exist. In fact, in 2010, my first big book for HarperCollins on Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, that was kind of the first time that anyone had used these newspaper sites to search on information, territorial New Mexico and the Kid and Garrett, and I really made great use of that. And then a few years later, I'm doing the Rough Riders, and I discovered that. Well, let me give you an example, and I mentioned this in the book. An author in the 1917s, Carrington Jones, wrote a book called Rough Riders. And he made this comment. He said that the Rough Riders were so busy that they didn't have time to write letters. And he mentioned there was a lack of letters and documents. Well, that's what seemed to him then, because there really weren't a lot, in archives or out there. But man, when I got on these newspaper sites, and of course it's character recognition, and I type in the words Rough Riders or Roosevelt, and there were just all kinds of letters that I found that these had written back to their local papers, or they might have written to their mom or their dad, and then the dad took it to the local paper. Hey, I just got a letter from my son in TR's unit, and it was published in the paper. And so basically every state that Rough Riders came from, I found letters written from the field giving updates on their experiences. And so I tried to make as much use of those as I could. And then I also went and, I tried to seek out, diaries and letters and manuscripts that some had been used before, but I found some things that had. And one of the great finds was at a Theodore Roosevelt collection at Harvard. And one of the members, his family, put together a Rough Rider scrapbook, like 3 volumes of scrapbooks. And they had pasted his letters in the scrapbook. So the letters, nobody knew about the letters. They just thought it was a scrapbook. Well, then I got start going through the scrapbook, and here's these wonderful letters written, from the field that are pasted in, and I was able to make use of them as well. So there really
That's
was
amazing.
there was a lot of stuff. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff out there. There actually, scrapbooks are just fantastic.
And I don't believe that's been digitized yet either.
I don't think it has either. In fact, one of the cool things there, he had picked up some cool stuff, but like he sent little souvenirs home. And I think if I remember correctly, there was like partial documents from the Spanish Army that were glued in there that he sent back. He also had I think it was wrappers from maybe the Spanish Mauser ammunition boxes or whatever. So there's little things he sent home and were glued in there. And also in that scrapbook are the photos, and I use these in my book, the before and after. I can't remember this soldier's name, but it shows him a photograph in Tampa, and then it shows him when he got home, and he's all thin and bandaged, and those were glued into the scrapbook. So he was pretty badly wounded. They had pasted in there the photos of his X-rays showing the bullet in his lungs. Those are in the scrapbook, and I didn't even know they could do X-rays then. I mean, it was just bizarre. It's like,
good grief.
I took a picture of. Remind me, I'll send it to you because it shows the bullet lodged in his chest.
Wow!
And it's the actual original X-ray photo. And the mom.
So these are just family scrapbooks that got donated to Harvard, and
it's in the scrapbook. It was pretty cool when I came across that. But I was shocked. I wasn't expecting all those things in there.
I've seen in the Roosevelt realm was when he was shot in 1912, and they have that X-ray, so it shows the bullet. Okay. But that's okay.
Yeah, that's
perfect.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I remember you made reference to the Herman Hagedorn Rough Rider research notes. Hagedorn, a real devotee to Roosevelt, who wrote a considerable number of biographical stuff for Roosevelt and had put together a lot of research notes for his book on Roosevelt's Rough Riders, but it sounds as if he didn't include some of those research notes that you you ended up using.
His book was a novel, right? And he took all kinds of information from these veterans to write this book. And of course, my interest was in the core, the manuscript material, not his novel. And so I made pretty good use of that. There were some good accounts in there and correspondence that he had, and his novel, The Rough Riders. I have a first edition copy of that, and it's signed by him to one of the Rough Riders that he used as a source, which was kind of cool. We'll get off in a tangent here on collecting, but because I'm a huge book collector, but the book dealers didn't realize that was a Rough Rider. It was signed to. It just said signed by Hagedorn. Well, of course, it was signed to one of the guys, in the regiment, and a pretty important one of the Harvard guys, actually. So,
goodness sakes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you use those sources, those diaries, those manuscripts, those scraps of notes and interviews from some pretty obscure sources in some cases. Something some of our listeners may or may not be aware of is there is a collection of Rough Rider interviews and notes down in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just find it amazing that less than a year later, they have a reunion during the summer of 1899. And in Las Vegas, and it made sense. A lot of New Mexicans were part of the larger portion, actually, from New Mexico, and easy to get to by train. So that's the first reunion. And then they moved it around occasionally. And here's a kind of an interesting aside. Theodore Roosevelt, he's a busy guy, and he kind of let them know, it's like, do we have to have these every year? Because there's a lot going on here in Washington, New York, or whatever. But anyway, they were all gung-ho, it's like, well, we got to get together again. It was almost like, college buddies. Oh yeah, come on, let's get together every year. Anyway, so in later years, they made Las Vegas the headquarters for the Veterans Association, or the Rough Riders Association, whatever they were terming it at the time. And then eventually they donated their collections to it's called the Rough Rider Memorial. The whole title is very long, the City of Las Vegas Museum and Rough Rider Memorial. And you know, in these collections, well, it's really nice. It's a very small place, institution. They don't have a lot of funding, but over the years, the archivists there, they developed files when they could of each member of the regiment. And in those files, there might be a letter, there might be pages from a diary, and a lot of times it's just newspaper obits or clippings. But yeah, I spent several days going through their boxes there in the archive and going through each file for a member and seeing if there was something there I could use. So yeah, that's one of those, like you say, one of those kind of unknown or hidden gems. And when we talk about artifacts later, one of my favorite ones is actually in that museum today.
Oh, that's right. I think maybe you've told me about that in the past. We'll save that for that portion.
Okay.
But I guess one of the reasons I bring up that Rough Rider Memorial Museum and some of their archives is one of my favorite and most poignant stories, I think, from your book. And there's many, but I realized in looking at the notes that there was a single witness to a story that you make reference to. And this is following the first battle at Las Guasimas, and we had what Roosevelt described as perhaps the finest officer in the regiment, Captain Capron, is killed in that first engagement. And there's this really touching story that could only have been written because you found this obscure reference to it by a person in the Rough Rider Memorial Archives. And that's that story of Captain Capron. Would you read for us from page 128 through the end of the next page?
That night, the men gathered around their different messes with emotions running between elation for their victory and deep sadness for the loss of friends. 8 Rough Riders had been killed and more than 40 were wounded. One of the men of Troop L, known for his sweet tenor voice, began to sing The Vacant Chair, probably the saddest song to come out of the Civil War. It was enough to choke a man up, one trooper remembered. Not far from camp, a guard kept watch over the bodies of the fallen, lined up in a row along the trail. Out of the darkness, a solitary figure approached the guard. He was wearing the uniform of a captain of artillery and looked to be in his early 50s. He asked to see the body of Captain Capron, explaining that he was Captain Alan Capron of the 1st U.S. Artillery. He was there to see his son's body. The guard watched as the senior Capron pulled back the blanket covering his son's face. The veteran artilleryman then snapped to attention, his body perfectly erect for several seconds. Next, his right hand came up sharply to his forehead in a salute. Then, without saying a word, Captain Capron turned and walked back down the trail.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have always been moved by that passage, and now as well. And again, that could only have been written by the one witness to that event, which was the guard.
Yeah. It does bring up many emotions, and Capron comes from a military family, but when your son joins or your daughter, the reality is that they may not come back. But on the other hand, and I'm also thinking of Theodore Miller, and Theodore Miller, he desperately wanted to go, and the family, they weren't keen on it. A lot of families would, and they're that way today, but you don't want to hold your child back, and you have to let him take that risk. And so all those emotions you think of when you see this story, I mean, his father was certainly proud of his son, and he died a hero's death, but he also experienced a tremendous loss. And how do you, put those things together? And so anyway, but I felt that for me in writing that story and in including that chapter, it really humanizes, It's not just a bunch of good old boys having fun, but danger and death were right there with them.
Right. And that for me is what makes your writing so interesting to read, is you've got all of that color, and we understand that it all comes from sources, materials, but I I was rereading over some of these passages, and I realized there are 6 different sources that went into a single paragraph just to make it feel as if you are right there in the middle of the action. And so that's a writer's gift that you have there, Mark.
Well, thanks. And that's why my writing takes so long, and why it can be so stressful, especially with deadlines. And the last book I did on Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, that was a 5-year project, and yet you'll see the same thing. I mean, for one episode or incident, I might have had to consult 7 or 8 different sources, and this yourselves. They don't often agree with one another, but in narrative writing, you can't. I mean, there's no way that I'm going to take up paragraphs debating what actually happened. No. When you're telling a story, you want it to flow. You want it to have the narrative to flow along. So you have to make decisions based on your sources and tell what you think happened. And then you can put in the notes, this is based on such and such and such. Some scholars disagree, or you can mention there's a controversy about this. But I'm not going to debate other historians in the body of the book. Some academic books, that's fine. That's the way they're written. But I want my books to be read, to be enjoyed, and I don't want people slowing down and eventually putting it down because, this is tedious. Make up your mind. What happened? So.
And that's what I loved. If I had that comment, I wanted to make sure I told you that in your attention to detail and using the primary sources, it is greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you. Well, and of course, this, Larry. Other people are going to want to check you out, right? And they're going to, it's like, I'm interested in this detail here, and so you put the sources there, so other scholars and amateur historians and just general readers. And today, it's so easy to check because if you go to Chronicling America, which is a free website, Library of Congress, he used the Oklahoma whatever, and here's the actual piece, and you can see, well, how well did I narrate that, based on the actual sources. So, but I for mentioning that, because I really, that's something I strive to do, and it makes it different from a lot of history books, especially trade books. And one of the things that really turns me off, and some readers, they don't care, but if I turn, one of the first things I do when I see a new book is I turn to the notes. And if I see a bunch of ibid, and if they're citing, popular histories and not original sources, well, then I'm not interested in that book because I know they didn't do their homework. They didn't do the original. My books, they have to have original research, lots of good notes.
Yeah. Well, we can shift gears from that sad story to a story from battle on page 166. This is the bully fight chapter where they're actually going up the San Juan ridgeline. And Roosevelt, from his perspective, does not include this full story, perhaps, in his account in the Rough Riders, but from several different diaries and interviews, you piece together this brief little exchange that happens between Roosevelt and a couple of troopers.
Hughes, a blacksmith from Tucson, Arizona, was bleeding freely from his own head wound, which he had received during the assault on Kettle Hill. A friend had wrapped a bandage around his head, but the bandage had fallen off, and the blood running down Hughes' face looked fairly gruesome. Roosevelt passed by, took one look at Hughes and another man with a head wound, Fred Bugbee of Troop A, and told them both to go to the rear, as their appearance could not have a good effect on the men. A minute later, Roosevelt saw the pair still on the firing line and said, "Didn't I order you men back?" "You go to hell. We are not going back," Bugbee said. Roosevelt turned and walked away, pretending he hadn't heard the young cowboy, whom he could have court-martialed for insubordination. Instead, he would later give Bugbee and Hughes official commendations for bravery.
I love that. I love that story. I love it for what it tells about the attitudes of the Rough Riders, but also about Roosevelt being an unconventional officer and leader.
And a man that they were willing to follow anywhere.
Fun story.
It shows why.
Yes. And, I think Roosevelt realized you can push only so far, and you can be a tyrant or whatever. And I think he recognized that, these men were there to fight. They didn't want to miss one moment. No. They wanted to stay on the line with their comrades. And but it's humorous. And And you're right. It's like he understood the situation and he let it go, and recognized them later. So.
Yeah. So there's a lot of those stories actually that Roosevelt talks about with the men basically sneaking out of the sick wards near the shorelines and making their way back to the battlefield, and there were actually several men who Roosevelt or some other officer sent backwards who found themselves back on the firing lines because, like you said, it was just too important. They didn't want to miss this chance to make their mark in history.
And I also think, there's that camaraderie, right?
Yes.
You want to be with your guys.
The band of brothers.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes perfect sense. But at the same time, it's just hilarious, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't I send you back?
I was going to say, I have an autograph album, and one of the men, it has 2 Rough Rider signatures. One of the men was with TR at Santiago de Cuba. This is signed in November of 1898, and he signs his name, Ira C. Hartzell, Santiago de Cuba. He's back home in Arizona, but he signs this album. One of the men left behind is further back in the album, and his name is J. Archer Wormel, and all he signs is Phoenix, Arizona, November 10th, 1898. He didn't even sign Rough Riders with it. He was so hurt being left behind, I feel. I mean, I can't prove that, but seeing the other one who's back in Arizona signing at Santiago de Cuba.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, you know this. There were guys that were crying in Florida when they weren't chosen. It was just heartbreaking for them.
Yes.
It probably saved their lives.
Oh, yeah.
With the disease, and if they didn't get shot, it was not pretty down there.
No.
But no, they were literally in tears.
Yeah, a third of the regiment left behind in Tampa, simply because there weren't enough troop transports to carry all the men.
But Kurt, it's so understandable for me because, number one, it was hard to get in. Number two, they went through the training, their horses. They went through so much, and they were so close.
Yes.
And then they didn't go. And the other thing I found was so ironic. You probably read these stories, but during this, when the Civil War broke out, there was this huge rush of enlistments, and everybody was afraid the war would be over before they could get there. And the same thing happened with Cuba, but it was actually true. The war did. Right. It only lasted a few months, so the Civil War had gone for 4 years, but it's like, it's going to be over before we can get down there. Well, sure enough, they were right. It didn't last very long. So.
Yeah, even some of the men who didn't make it to Cuba still suffered with malaria and some of those tropical diseases. Yeah. Stout young men, whether they were Harvard men or cowpunchers out in the Southwest, they still weren't suited for tropical conditions. And Roosevelt bragged that his regiment suffered the highest level of casualties of any cavalry regiment in Cuba.
One thing also that I find interesting in talking about those that didn't go, and the ones that went, of course, they became iconic, right? They charged up San Juan Hill. And so just think, people, your daughter or grandchild is asking you in the Rough Riders, did you charge San Juan Hill with TR? Well, no, we got left in Florida. It's like your comrades became heroes, and like I say, they were icons. And then when you're asked, you're in the Rough Riders. Well, but I didn't actually go to Cuba.
Right.
It had to be, it was bad enough when they got left behind, but it was 10 times worse afterwards.
Yeah, I think Roosevelt would have gone as a corporal if he had to. To get to Cuba.
Yeah. He would have snuck on.
He would have.
Yeah.
So, the research that I've done on some of the Rough Riders who did perish, whether it was months or even years later, that was the cause of death is just complications of having spent of those battle conditions in the tropics. Mm-hmm. So, it's really, really tragic. I think you've made mention of this before. It's difficult to affix a good number to the deaths and casualties of the Rough Riders for some of those reasons.
Oh, yeah. No, the fevers, the malaria, the typhoid fever, my doctor explained, it weakened their systems. And so even though they seemed healthy when they got back, they would get pneumonia and die, and so their immune systems were compromised by that experience. But I thought of something I wanted to be sure to mention. And, the Rough Riders, there were also Buffalo Soldiers that were part of, this invasion of Cuba. And it was interesting to me how war changed the Rough Riders' perceptions of African-American troops. And, of course, they weren't allowed to join, the Rough Riders. But I remember in the march to Las Guasimas, and there was an episode where they got to this stream. But then someone noticed that these Buffalo Soldiers had been drinking and were in the water upstream. And they all decided we're not going to be drinking downstream from those guys. But by the time they were up on San Juan Hill, they were sharing blankets with Buffalo Soldiers on top of San Juan Hill. I mean, and I even quote in my book, their opinion of them as fighters, they marveled at the Buffalo Soldiers. And so, I would like to think that whereas some had very racist attitudes at the beginning, I would like to think that their experiences with the Buffalo Soldiers were changed by what they saw themselves. And like I say, they shared the blankets with black men on top of San Juan Hill. So that was a huge thing in 1898.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, there was a controversy involving Roosevelt because of malaria and the fear of yellow fever in the troops. So how'd that affect Roosevelt?
Well, he was a good officer at looking out for his men. And, of course, malaria was rampant. And he felt his regiment needed to go home. And which is kind of ironic because he was also volunteering them for Puerto Rico just before. The illness was serious. And, yes, people were dying. And he ended up writing a letter that, explaining the conditions and his recommendations. And he wanted to submit it to Shafter, and in charge of the military force there in Cuba. And there was a correspondent there in the same tent, and Shafter, wouldn't take the letter and kind of pushed it over towards the correspondent, and it was published all over the papers. And I completely understand why the Secretary of War would be incensed or enraged by this.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently he had already issued orders for some of the troops to be withdrawn. But, you've got, a colonel and who's broadcasting the problems in Cuba that makes the War Department look horrible, and they already looked horrible, right? They got all kinds of bad press from the very beginning. So,
right.
and it was also they were in the midst of negotiations with Spain, and all of a sudden you've got this letter that says we're in bad shape down here, and so
if you keep us here another 2 or 3 weeks, our force could be decimated.
So. It was not a good look for the military, and certainly TR overstepped, crossed some lines, lots of lines there. But on the other hand, like I said before, he's a good officer. He cares, any good officer, you're going to do whatever you can, and for the benefit of your men. And you know what? It got things happening, right? It got things moving.
It did.
And so in some ways maybe that was a good thing too, to draw attention to this, because people at home didn't know what was going on, and why don't I get a letter from so and so or whatever, and he's in the hospital. And of course, there was, I think, one correspondent predicted this would ruin Roosevelt's political career for years to come.
Right. Because there was a pretty nasty public squabble going on between Roosevelt and Secretary of War Alger. And and it certainly did cost Roosevelt the opportunity to be nominated and receive the Medal of Honor in his lifetime.
I
Alger had the ability to deny that, perhaps?
Yes. I just think Alger and a lot of people, the guy's the most famous American, and now we're going to give him a Medal of Honor. it's like for them, TR, we've just got too much of TR, and why would we add something else to his record? It's like, no, we're not going there.
So probably a lot of our listeners know the rest of the story here, but Roosevelt talks about rising like a rocket. His war fame from the Spanish-American War, no sooner is the unit mustering out, a couple of months later than the Republican Party nominates Roosevelt to run for governor of the state of New York.
and very, what a savvy politician, but he goes on the campaign trail with Rough Riders in uniform, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like perfect, So, well, before we get away from Alger, I wanted to just mention, and of course, I collect books. I love books. And Alger wrote a book on the history of the Spanish-American War. And let's see, I have a copy, and and I did use his book as a source. The Spanish-American War by R.A. Alger. It came out in 1901. It came out after T.R.'s book. But I have a signed copy, and it's signed to John Davis Long, the Secretary.
Oh my goodness!
Oh wow!
Okay, this is the
Secretary of
inscription. This will send chills down your spine. Honorable John D. Long, in memory of the days that tried us all. Isn't that cool? In memory of the days that tried us all. And it did try them. I mean, the Secretary of War and the Navy, they had to organize all of this and send the country and their army to war. And to me, that's such a great, in memory of the days that tried us all. I mean, it was very trying for everybody. But what a book to have, the first edition from the former Secretary of the War, the Secretary, and it has John Davis Long's book plate in it as well. So
goodness sakes,
yeah.
That's quite a find.
I got that on eBay for like $25 or whatever.
Goodness.
And again, it's one of those things, you have to have some knowledge. The seller didn't mention anywhere that it was inscribed to the Secretary of the Navy.
Oh my!
It just said signed copy. It is like, oh my God, it's signed to John Davis Long, and of course he has a TR connection as well.
Oh yeah,
TR was under him. So
the assistant secretary. Yes.
Yeah.
So Roosevelt had given him both fits during his. Maybe that was all the trouble that he was referring to. Is just Roosevelt.
That could be. He may have had that in mind. Yeah.
Look at the times when Theodore Roosevelt caused us trouble. So,
and there was that war as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Rough Riders going with Roosevelt. One of my favorite stories is Buck Taylor, one of the sergeants, who is on the campaign trail with Roosevelt, and he's speaking for him, and he goes, "Vote for my colonel. Vote for my colonel. If you elect him, he will lead us as he led us in Cuba, like sheep to the slaughter." Nothing like a ringing endorsement.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. And you make reference to that towards the end of the book about, as Roosevelt rose through political life, eventually to he's president within 3 years of the mustering out of the Rough Riders, and they were with him for the rest of his career. Wherever he went, there was always a gathering of Rough Riders, particularly in the West. But your chapter 11 talks about the Rough Riders as veterans and the children of the dragon's blood, as Roosevelt referred to them.
Yeah. I pitched to my editor, I wanted that to be the title of my book, Children of the Dragon's Blood. Oh, wow. And it did not go over well. And, from their viewpoint, it's like, Mark, how could you have a better title than Rough Riders? I mean, it tells you immediately what it's about, but I just love that phrase, Children of the Dragon's Blood. And then my agent, he said, Mark, it sounds like it's a science fiction novel. Anyway, but I said, well, I'm going to, at least I can put it as the title of a chapter. So, again, you're right, Kurt. His men, I would say the vast majority of his men truly loved Roosevelt, and he loved them, and he showed his love so many times by trying to advance them in their careers and by appointments, whether it's territorial governors or U.S. marshals. And
3 Rough Riders become territorial governors. Roosevelt names. That's astonishing.
And they, in criticisms of Roosevelt, they brought this up often. Nepotism and the Rough Riders. But, again, we talked about that, Larry, this band of brothers, this bond that was formed in, where they risked death together. And I'd have to say that those appointments were usually good appointments. Yeah. I mean, they were good men and they did their jobs. There were certain individuals that weren't as good, but hey, that
happens.
Things happen. Yeah, the
He still
majority.
felt in his mind he was still putting forward the best candidates. They
Yeah.
just happened to be Rough Riders.
Yeah.
It's-
One of my, and I have several of these stories in there, but one of my favorite is the one about Ben Daniels, and we know how Theodore Roosevelt loved Westerners and Western characters, and Ben Daniels was a real Western character, frontiersman, and he was really impressed with him. And and he loved the stories that Daniels told him about his Old West experiences, and so he nominates him for U.S. Marshal. But then it turns out the one story that Daniels didn't tell was when he was arrested for stealing mules, and now he's nominated for U.S. And so of course this came out, and it was a huge embarrassment. But TR stuck with him. He made sure he got the appointment to be the head of prisons or whatever in Arizona, and then later he renominated him for the U.S. Marshal, and he got it.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I just thought it was funny, so many times TR got embarrassed because of certain things that weren't revealed to him. But,
And those Rough Riders are expecting TR to bail them out when they get in trouble too. You included that quote from Roosevelt's wife Edith in there that it felt as if we were the parents of 1,000 very large and very bad children.
Yeah. Well, I think
Frank Brito is a story.
Oh yeah, it's like he gets in trouble and he kills his sister-in-law. And he wants help, and it's like, I didn't mean to kill her. I was aiming for my wife. So, like that made a difference or whatever. So, but yeah,
but they knew Colonel Roosevelt would help them out. So,
and in fact, he did help. There was a gentleman in Colorado who went to prison, and
Collier, I think.
Yeah, one of his commanders said, "Hey, he's a good guy. If you could write a letter, it would help." And Roosevelt did. He did write a letter. And, that's one of those, I never was able to find out what happened to him. He got out of prison, and I just wondered if he changed his name or what, but was never able to track down the rest of his story. But the President of the United States writes a letter to the pardon board. That's got to make a difference. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a real indication of that two-way loyalty that went between Roosevelt and his boys, as he called them, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
And then it almost seems as if they expected Roosevelt to be their employment agent, writing to him for the smallest of jobs and appointments. But I know Roosevelt got exasperated that before he became president, the Rough Riders would write him, and they would just expect that he could snap his fingers and get him a job somewhere, and it was not the case.
Well, and I have this story in there, and I found this again somewhere. If a Rough Rider happened to be in Washington, let's go see the colonel. And of course, he'd love to see him.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a congressman, and he wanted to see Roosevelt, and he went and they said, "Oh, sorry, he's with somebody." And then he found out he turned around and left. "Oh, he's with a Rough Rider. I'll never get in today." So he just turned around and gave up. It's like, he's with a Rough Rider. It's not going to happen today. So, yeah, if you were a member of the regiment showed up, you had entree into the Oval Office. Well, I don't know if they had an Oval Office then, but you had entree to see Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Into his
Speaking
office,
of the White House, I love it every time there's a press conference with President Biden, and right behind him up there in the Roosevelt room, and there's that painting of TR.
Yeah.
As Colonel Rough Riders, and I just get a kick out of that whenever I see, those press, and there's that painting. I mean, TR still has this presence, right?
Yeah.
Even today. Yep.
It does. And that room was his office during the presidency.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and, I think to me, it just says something. It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. No. They can they get to decide if that if the painting is going to stay in there or not. And it's like nope, we're going to keep TR in here. So he's inspiring even today.
Well, we think so. We part of that inspiration too is the eventual awarding of the Medal of Honor, and I think we've mentioned this to you before, but just a really interesting way that you bookend the story is with Medal of Honor ceremonies. The one Rough Rider during the actual conflict that ended up being awarded the the Medal of Honor was the surgeon, Rob Church.
James Rob Church, yes. Well, I tell you, it was just a moment of inspiration or just, a lightning bolt. I mean, I'm so proud of that way of constructing the book, to bookend it with these two ceremonies. And, sometimes you get an inspiration or whatever, and it just seemed to be so fitting to start it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And also, that also tells you, about this bond. I mean, at the very opening chapter, it means so much. These guys were Rough Riders, and then Roosevelt, who was unjustly denied his medal, and all the evidence says he deserved it, and the people that served with him said that he deserved it, and to end with another ceremony where a Rough Rider is getting a Medal of Honor. By the way, I wanted to say, I'm glad you brought up James Rob Church. So, and we talked earlier about resources and research. Generally, for every Medal of Honor, the National Archives has a Medal of Honor file. And so it was a file for James Rob Church, which I examined in person. And I can guarantee to you that I was the first person to untie that red ribbon that was around those folders and that documentation for his Medal of Honor and the correspondence. And so that was a real treat to be able to go through those. But yeah, I was the first. I mean, that they were tied up, like I say, in that classic 19th century red ribbon, and that I was the first one to untie that and unfold those documents.
I think it was from your book that I learned for the first time that it was Roosevelt who initiated the president as commander-in-chief to be the one to personally present a Medal of Honor to its recipient in the White House.
Yeah. He wanted it to be special, like other countries. And he I really think you can ascribe to him to elevating the Medal of Honor's importance and significance.
Yeah.
He was the first one to do that. And it was intentional. Like I said, he wanted this to be something on par with the top medals in other countries and recognizing bravery and honor and
the Queen bestows the Victoria Cross
exactly
to the recipients.
And I didn't know that either until I looked into it, and soldiers, they got their medals in the mail. That was now apparently in some army posts when a Medal of Honor was they would call out the troops and an officer would present the medal. But often it just came to you. There were a lot of medals that were given after the Civil War, and it wasn't so hard to get a medal. You just had to have several people write in, and it would come. I've actually seen the for one particular medal what it came in, the wrapping or whatever. Guy got it in the mail, and he had his Medal of Honor. Yeah,
goodness sakes.
Roosevelt is the one that changed all of that. So.
And how special as the commander-in-chief, then, to be able to be the one to bestow the Medal of Honor on one of his own troopers.
Yes.
I can't imagine how special that was for both of them.
Well, I think in a way, Roosevelt was kind of getting he was getting some retribution. He wasn't given the Medal of Honor, but he could give it to one of his men and make a big deal of it, to have it right there in Washington and do it in person. And I think it meant a lot to him to be able to do that. And I think he was sharing in it in a way with James Rob Church.
And you closed the book then, like you said, with Roosevelt posthumously, what is it, almost 103 years later, he is receiving the award posthumously through his great-grandson, Tweed Roosevelt.
And, tell you, again, we live in an amazing time, but just how cool is it that I could go to YouTube and watch that ceremony?
Watch it.
So, I didn't witness it, but, as a writer, I had the perfect resource to write from. I could actually watch it in person as it happened. So, and I mentioned it in the book and how fitting that at the same ceremony, an African-American soldier's family is also receiving the Medal of Honor. So anyway, it's very, I think to me, any Medal of Honor ceremony is so moving, and I've
Right.
watched several, and I just, again, we can thank TR for making it special. It's
Yeah. Well, I know we could go on for a considerable amount of time talking with you, Mark, about your research, your writing process, and the love that we all share for Roosevelt and his regiment. But we probably should be wrapping it up. I did want to ask you if you had any personal reading recommendations regarding Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Anything that maybe some of our listeners might not already be familiar with, as maybe you discovered in part of the research.
Well, I mean, of course, I think everybody should read Roosevelt's book on the Rough Riders, published in 1899 and originally appeared. What was it in script? No, it was serialized first.
Yeah.
And was it Scribner's? Is that right?
I believe so.
Okay.
I believe, yeah.
But it actually, to me, most people, they don't look at those original articles, but there's more information in the serialized article than what appeared in the book. There's some differences, so it's worth looking at both. But I know TR got criticized. A lot of people, I mean, well, not a lot, but they thought it was so much about him, and I didn't see it that way at all. He's it's his book. He's chronicling the experiences of himself and his regiment, and he gives credit to other troops in that book. And I don't know how other historians miss this, because they'll criticize it and say, oh, he failed to recognize this or that. He gives a lot of credit to other regiments that were there in Cuba. And anyway, I don't see it as a self-promoting book at all. I see it as an excellent resource on the experiences of these men as well as himself. So anyway, that's a book that I would definitely recommend to get his perspective on what was and it was a very important resource for me. So there were other books that came out of that, but that was a very important one for telling my story.
Yeah.
And one thing I discovered with the Rough Riders, in the earlier editions, they include TR's sermon that he gave at Camp Wyckoff and his mustering out speech after they presented him with the Bronco Buster. Later editions cut that out.
Okay.
And so it's the earlier versions, and I haven't had a chance to look at the serialized parts, but I wonder if they included that as well. So
yeah, I can't remember, and that's another thing too about his book, and especially those serialized articles, the wealth of photography. There was a lot of photography during the Civil War, but nothing like the Spanish-American War. And again, the cameras are more advanced; they're handheld. So there's just a wealth of visual materials. And so in those early articles, or the first versions before the book, there's a lot more photographic images as illustrations. And so that's another reason to go to those too.
Well, I noticed in the book, and quite a few of the pictures makes reference to picture was from the author's collection.
Oh.
So I know that you are a person who collects stuff, who admires books and likes those pieces of material culture and artifacts. So I wanted to ask, is there one or two particular pieces of material culture that you think most interestingly tell the story of the Rough Riders?
Well, one of my favorite artifact that's tied to the Rough Riders is in Las Vegas, New Mexico. It's at the City of Las Vegas Museum and Rough Rider Memorial, and I love it because it's kind of like this hidden secret or hidden gem that hardly anyone knows about, but it's just this amazing artifact. And it's when the Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill at the blockhouse, and again, when you read my book, and you all know this, there was more than one blockhouse on San Juan Hill. And there's the famous blockhouse that's often depicted, but the Rough Riders also charged the blockhouse. And when we say blockhouses, these were just houses that were fortified. It wasn't like they were a fort that somebody built. They were a ranchero, whatever you want to call it, and they fortified them. And so the Rough Riders from Kettle Hill charged their own blockhouse. And Theodore Roosevelt got very frustrated because they tried to say he didn't charge San Juan Hill. But if you look at the actual U.S. government or Army maps from the time, that whole ridge is labeled San Juan Hill.
Yeah.
And as TR said, we're nitpicking here. It's we charge San Juan Hill just as much as anybody else, and
Right.
and they met resistance also in their charge.
Yeah.
But anyway, when they got to the top, they captured a Spanish bugler who was in one of the trenches, and John Greenway took the bugler's bugle. And so this bugle is in the museum in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and it's even inscribed. He had a jeweler do an inscription, captured July 1st, 1898, San Juan Hill, and John Greenway, his name's on there. And it's amazing to me that what I call a Smithsonian-worthy artifact is here in this small museum in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And again, when we talk about that, this episode in TR's life is a direct connection to his ascent to the presidency of the United States. That's what makes it Smithsonian worthy. Here is something from that moment in time that made an icon, that made a regiment iconic. And you can see it, and it's behind a piece of glass there in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So, you can go to the National Museum of American History, and you can see Leonard Wood's uniform, and you can see other Roosevelt and Rough Rider artifacts. But to me, that bugle that was captured from a Spanish soldier just, thrills me to see.
Yeah. I think you told me about that earlier, and I made a point of looking for it when I went down there the first time. So
good.
Yeah.
And you saw it?
I did, yeah.
Good, great.
It's pretty
I
great.
need to make a trip.
Yes.
Yes.
Field trip, Larry.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite artifacts I ever saw was at Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt's hat that was on the one elk antler when I was there originally, and with the sword that got left behind in camp. But
yeah, I desperately wanted to see the Bronco Buster bronze that the regiment gave, but when I went to Sagamore Hill, they were restoring the interior, and they had loaned it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So I went, on the same trip, I had to go to New York anyway. So I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was not on display because they were getting ready to have it in some exhibit somewhere else. So I never got to see the original Bronco Buster. But
I'm hanging on to it right here.
Yeah, he has it.
Oh,
in the back.
you are?
Yeah.
Nice. Well, okay, now I know where it was. So anyway, but what I did get to see, which is pretty cool, and it has a Remington connection, I had to do a research trip to, I wanted to go to San Antonio. I wanted to see the area in the missions, where they trained, and go to the Minger, of course. Well, it just so happened that at the Museum of the Big Bend in Alpine, Texas, they had an exhibit of Remington paintings, and they had borrowed the Remington painting of the charge up Kettle Hill, and it was on display. So I made a special trip. I said, Alpine's on my way home, and I went to Alpine, and I got to go see and stand in front of Remington's painting, and I took multiple pictures, and it's actually my photograph of the painting that appears in the book. But that museum belongs to the Frederick Remington Museum in New York State, and you can see it there. But they had borrowed it for this special exhibit, and it didn't travel anywhere else. And I tell you what, it was the highlight of the exhibit because it was bigger than anything else. It was huge, and against this one wall. And I spent an hour there taking photos and taking close-ups, and it was, anyway, that was a real thrill to see.
Yeah.
But of course, that painting was San Juan Hill like the bugle, so it's a close second. It's a close second to the bugle.
Right.
And in December 2019, we were invited to Sagamore Hill as Theodore and Edith to portray them there. And they wanted us to film the Christmas greeting for the National Park Service in the North Room. So I'm climbing over things, making sure I don't stand on like the lion rug or anything. And I look on the mantle, and there is Bronco Buster. And I looked at the park ranger, and I said, "Can I just touch one little corner?" And he's like, "No." But I was an inch from it, just staring and in awe. I mean, it was like shaking hands with Colonel Roosevelt.
It goes back to your theme of this Western story, and how fitting that could be presented a Remington bronze of a cowboy. So, yeah, it all ties together.
Yeah.
Wasn't that Remington's first bronze?
I believe
read
so.
that somewhere.
One of his more famous ones, I know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
there are many copies out there. I understand. Kurt
Yeah.
may be aware of one. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
got it right here. Well, Mark, we thank you so much for being our premier author on the Talk About Teddy podcast and for being a part of this discussion to talk about your excellent work, Rough Riders. And Larry, any parting comments?
I want to thank you again for the due diligence of the primary resource searching and having that force of will like Theodore Roosevelt to make sure that you did this well and pushed it through.
And I'm glad to be the first. There will only be one first ever, so I'm glad to have that spot. So so thanks for having me on, guys.
Oh,
Thank you, Mark. Wow, what a great conversation today with Mark Lee Gardner, author of Rough Riders, Theodore Roosevelt, his Cowboy Regiment, and the Immortal Charge up San Juan Hill. Well, folks, if you love reading about TR as much as we do, if you enjoy reading military history and American Western history, then you really do need to have this book in your library. You can pick yourself up a copy and maybe one for somebody you care about at our website, talkaboutteddy.com, where you can find a link to go purchase a copy or two online. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
You can find this podcast on our website, talkaboutteddy.com, where you can see show notes and transcripts, links to resources, and additional TR content. And please, tell us what you think.
If you've enjoyed our content, please consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about us, because it really does make a tremendous difference and it helps others find this show.
We hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And until then, as our friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you have where you are.
bullet.